Hi everyone, I thought I would do a short video on how I wire these old Shinohara 3-rail switches. 3-rail meaning standard and narrow gauge for the railroad. I've used these for many years. Did my first wiring in these probably nearly 20 years ago. The previous layout was wired for DCC, even though at the time I was still using DC. But I learned how to wire these 3-rail switches so they would be A, DCC friendly, and B, routing of power, so you don't rely on the points for the continuity. When you look at these old switches, a couple things come to mind. They are insulated at the frogs, so that there's you do not have to cut any of the rail or at the frogs on the switches themselves. But if you do lay these switches anywhere that the power comes in this direction, you will need to gap so there is no short. So what I do with these switches, and I was talking at the previous video, let's take a look at one that I've wired here. These have 10 wires to them, providing power. I always use the old red to the rear method. So it provides power to the double rails with the red wires. The black wires, there's 2 connections to the single rail. The other trick on this is to use the polarity switch on the momentary contact switch, if you will, on the bullfrogs from Fast Tracks that I'm using. These green wires all connect to the part of the switch where I wire the frog to on the bullfrogs. There are 4 connections here. First, what I did this time was I connected 2 wires, 1 to each of the points. Previous work that I've done on these switches and over in the Santa Fe rail yard section, I would just bridge the 2 points with a wire, single wire. What I found, though, I think it does restrict the movement of the points so that they can be very stiff to move. What I've done here is to solder each wire to the underside of each point, and then a single hole drilled into the benchwork, which will give the points and the wires a lot of room to flex and not restrict the movement of the points. The frog here is wired for power, polarity, and the far frog here is wired. So it makes it very simple and very reliable when you wire these for power and polarity. You don't need to worry about the points on the standard gauge side. What I do here is I just put a jumper wire in between the rail and the points, the single point for the standard gauge. I do not run much standard gauge, if probably at all, on the new layout. But I do want to make sure that I've wired them in case I do want to run some standard gauge. Now, when you lay these, this end of the switch, if there is trackage going this direction, you do not need to worry about a gap because the power is flowing from this end, and depending upon how your switch is thrown, it will have the polarity correct. This end, if you have a feeder wire here, depending on how the switch is thrown, you will need to gap somewhere between the feeder wire and the switch. So I generally will gap somewhere in the middle to make it easy. You'll need to do this on both legs of the switch, both the normal and the reversing side, to make sure there is no issue with shorting for the DCC. So that's pretty much it. When I was doing this layout, I had to go back and pull one of my old switches to remind myself how I did it 15, 18 years ago, but it went pretty quick. I did 8 switches in an afternoon, so once you get the hang of it, and if your soldering skills are good, it doesn't take long at all. So that's how I do the 3-rail switches, narrow gauge, standard gauge, and they have a good short protection and good contact for power to the engines. Okay, thanks.